There may not be any electrical sockets in the Great Smoky Mountains, but that doesn't mean they're safe for your toddler. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Most of the missing 411 cases that we cover happened relatively recently. Rarely do we look at an incident that occurred before 1950. For the most part, this is because we've encountered problems finding sources for some of these older tales, and this makes them difficult to analyze. Every once in a while, however, that's not the situation, and we're able to find enough solid evidence that allows us to get to the bottom of something. This is one such instance. On March 11th, 1919, a little boy by the name of Abe Ramsey vanished from his family's farm, nestled in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains in the area of Cosby, Tennessee. The Ramseys were ostensibly farmers, though proving such a thing is difficult due to the limited availability of records from such rural parts of Tennessee at that time. That said, Abe's father was named John Ramsey, and I was able to find a John C. Ramsey who matched the proper age and location and was a farmer. However, this was only through one census record, so it's hard to say for sure if this is the correct John Ramsey, as it was from before he would have had any kids, and there were a lot of John Ramseys in the area. Either way, he was popular enough in town that when his youngest son went missing, everybody in the community went looking for him. In a bit of a twist for a missing 411 case, however, the National Park Service was not involved, because it didn't yet exist in the state of Tennessee. Prior to 1923, the Smokies weren't part of the National Park System, and the system itself was only founded in 1916. And here is the part of the video where I'm going to tell you that there's going to be a short history segment, and that if you're not interested in watching it, you can just skip to the following chapter. But before we get into that part, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Factor. How does Factor factor into this video, you may be wondering? Well, when it's 4 in the morning and I'm up researching and I don't feel like making myself spaghetti bolognese, I will go into my fridge and I will pick myself out a beautiful meal of filet mignon, salmon, there's cavatappi, there's eggplant. I mean, there's delicious stuff in there. There's a lot of things that I like about Factor, from the fact that there's 34 plus menu options at any given time, that everything comes with a full list of nutritional facts so I can see what it is that I'm eating, and most importantly, the convenience. It's just so easy. Well, I want to be clear that Factor is a perfectly good option for lunch, dinner, even breakfast. They have a bunch of really fun breakfast selections, like they've got pancakes. For me, what really is nice about it is that I can get a restaurant flavor quality meal from my fridge. I don't have to bother with takeout. I don't have to worry about what's going into the food that's available at 3 in the morning. I can just put something good into the microwave and then into my body and be happy. If you'd like to give Factor a try, you can head to factor75.com or click the link in the description and use code LORELODGE50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off the next 4. I will say, one recommendation I have is try one of the steak meals. You will be pleasantly surprised at how good the steak meals are. But anyway, I don't think you need any more convincing. Once again, it is factor75.com, code LORELODGE50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off the next month's boxes. Now, if you're still here, I assume you do in fact want to see the history segment, so let's get into that part. Now, you may know that the first national park was Yellowstone, named for the river which flows through its, ready for this, 2,219,791 acres of territory. You may also know that it is nearly half a century older than the national park system. Yellowstone National Park was created by an act of Congress called the Act of Dedication, signed into law by President Ulysses S. Grant in 1872. So to be more specific, Yellowstone National Park predates the National Park Service and System by 44 years. The act declared the land to be reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or sale under the laws of the United States, and that all persons who shall locate or settle upon or occupy the area shall be considered trespassers and removed therefrom. That whole thing about removing trespassers, however, would have to wait a few years until the Army finally said enough and put their fort down. But while Yellowstone was the first national park, it wasn't the origin of the concept. That honor falls to California, who in 1864 requested federal permission to protect the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Big Grove. Yeah, the Mariposa Big Grove. There are discussions to be had about their motivations due to the, at the time, rather recent conflicts they had had with the Awanichi tribes, but that's another video for another time. In fact, if I'm being honest, that was another video at another time, but now I can't remember which one it was, and I even looked. Moving back east a ways, however, the second national park to be established was Mackinac Island National Park. This park was considerably smaller than Yellowstone, and I mean, it was just over 1,000 acres. The motivation here was that the island was becoming a very popular vacation spot, and Michigan Senator Thomas W. Ferry wanted to see it protected from further development. He succeeded, and the park was established in 1875. At the same time as the establishment of the parks, the US government also created an office within the Department of Agriculture, which was intended to assess the state of the nation's forests. The office was established in 1876, but it quickly became clear that they were going to need a larger workforce, so it was expanded in 1881 to become the Division of Forestry. A decade later, the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 granted the president the power to create forest reserves without a further act of Congress. These forests would be managed by the Department of the Interior. The problem here was that the Division of Forestry, which was equipped to manage these forests, was part of the Department of Agriculture, which is an issue that you would think would have seemed quite obvious. Instead, it took 15 years for the government to finally remedy this, finally passing the Transfer Act of 1905 partially at the behest of President Theodore Roosevelt. This handed stewardship of protected forests over to the Division of Forestry, which was renamed to the U.S. Forest Service. However, it remained within the Department of Agriculture. Roosevelt is very important to this story, though, because he was a very hardcore conservationist, and he saw the national parks and forests as a way of preserving America's national beauty, creating Crater Lake National Park and Wind Cave National Park in 1902 and 1903, respectively. In 1903, Teddy spent some time on a camping trip with the famed Scottish-American explorer and naturalist John Muir. And during that camping trip, Muir expressed to Teddy something he had expressed to a number of other officials. He felt that Yosemite would be best handled by the federal government. Just a few years later, in 1906, the federal government officially assumed control of the Yosemite Valley, which since 1891 had been partially managed by the U.S. Army Cavalry, hence the National Park Service unparalleled drip.
This is called drip, it's different.
Along with Crater Lake, Wind Cave, and Yosemite, Roosevelt also established Sully's Hill, Mesa Verde, and Platte National Parks during his second term, as well as 18 national monuments and 150 national forests. There was just one problem. Only the forests had any sort of management structure established. So, in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson managed to get something right for the first time in his life when he signed the National Park Service Organic Act, formally establishing the system and service in the Department of the Interior. Unfortunately, he did not bother to move the U.S. Forest Service into the Department of the Interior, which would have been the efficient and reasonable thing to do at the time. But hey, it wouldn't be the federal government if it wasn't complicated and wasteful, right? In any case, by the time that act was signed, there were 12 national parks in operation, if we're only counting parks and not monuments or historical or military parks. If we count those, there's actually a lot more, but none of the just normal national parks were in the Appalachian Mountains. There had been interest in creating an Appalachian park for several decades, and Rocky Mountain National Park served as proof of concept after it was established in 1915. It would not be until 1923 that the government set aside a misty corridor of those ridges known as the Great Smoky Mountains, far too late to be of assistance to little Abe Ramsey. As the story goes, 3-year-old Abe Ramsey lived with his family in the Cosby area of the Great Smoky Mountains, right by the county line between Sevier and Cocke counties. His father, John Ramsey, owned a modest 10-acre farm, but it was sufficient for little more than feeding the 9 members of his family. The 2 eldest daughters of the family had already married off and lived with their husbands, so it was John, his wife Mary Jane, and their 5 other children, the oldest of which was 15 years old. While the farm was the assumed and legal source of the family's income, John's real occupation was making moonshine, which in America typically refers to a clear, unaged whiskey. One thing that you will notice immediately if you ever have the misfortune of tasting moonshine is that it's frequently unaged. It's not a pleasant experience. It's just not. When I was in college, my roommates met a guy from town who I guess made moonshine in his backyard, and we made the really stupid decision of trying to have some. It was basically like drinking Everclear. I'm sure there are people out there who have made moonshine that's palatable, but this guy was not one of them. I sometimes think back to college and about the fact that I let a strange man give me a plastic bottle full of moonshine and didn't question it. We are. Anyway, during the Prohibition years, the ban on the sale and production of alcohol for non-medicinal purposes led to the creation of an entire industry surrounding homemade alcohol. And for farmers in the Appalachians, the rugged terrain and the level of isolation from federal law enforcement made moonshine stills very easy to hide, and the laws against alcohol made them very profitable. Of course, the law also meant dire legal consequences for anyone caught making that sweet, sweet Mountain Dew. Hence the front of being a simple farmer and miller. Most days, John would do some farming or grind cornmeal at the mill, just enough to, keep the law off his back if they ever came knocking, and then he would head off to do the real money making up in them thar hills. The morning of March 11th, 1919 was no different, as John headed off to work while his children headed off down the country road to the local schoolhouse. All except for Abe and his little sister Ida, who were too young to be going to school. Instead, Abe stayed home playing with Motley, the family's giant raw-boned hound, a term which I have to believe is a misprint of red-boned coonhound, as raw-boned hound does not appear to be a term. Red-boned coonhounds are a hunting breed bred from a mix of foxhounds and bloodhounds brought over by Scottish immigrants during the 19th century. And sometime that morning, after hearing dogs barking from the forest, Motley shot out to see what was going on. A few hours later, when the dog still hadn't returned, Abe went to go looking for him. The toddler put on his coat, leaving the house at about 3:30 in the afternoon. A little while later, after Mary Jane realized that her son had wandered off, she called out for him, told him to come back to the house, checked all over the place, but couldn't find him. Eventually, she checked under the porch where she found the family dog whimpering and scared and evidently having been in a fight. Around 4 p.m., the rest of the Ramsey children returned home from school and were immediately sent out to look for their little brother, but no sign of Abe could be found. But they too failed to locate the child. Now, as I said, this was before the days of organized professional search efforts, and there was no National Park Service present in the Great Smokies. That meant that the only people around to help were the locals and the law, which could be a problem for a man in John Ramsey's position. So it was that for 4 days, neighbors, family, and friends combed the forest without any organized assistance, turning over every bit of brush in a 3-mile radius around the Ramseys' farm. Unfortunately, all that could be found was a set of child-sized bare footprints in the road a good way off from the home. The Ramseys eventually had to give up the search, and the disappearance of his youngest son haunted John for years. The man would talk to everybody who would listen about it, insisting that the boy had been kidnapped. But if that were the case, nobody could say who the culprit was. Theories abounded, but with no evidence to support any of them, the case was never solved, and Abe Ramsey's fate remains a mystery. At least, that's how David Paulides tells the story in Missing 411 Eastern United States, and he gives the following as his commentary. I do find one aspect of this disappearance as being unusual and not consistent with the normal behavior of a family guard dog, and that was the behavior of Motley. I also find it unusual that the behavior of the dog and the other barking dogs coincided with Abe's disappearance. Big family dogs are not afraid of bears. Bears are afraid of dogs. That wasn't a bear that took on a group of dogs and caused Motley to run and hide under the house. Whatever caused Motley's injuries and the disruption of the other dogs on the mountain was probably somehow related to the disappearance of Abe. Now, just to clarify, there are newspaper articles from the time that posit he was unfortunately eaten by a bear, and David Paulides based his retelling and his conclusions on 3 sources which he names in the chapter, noting that 2 tell essentially the same story. The first source is Lost, a Ranger's Journal of Search and Rescue by Dwight McCarter, which uses an account of the story by Bayard H. Christie as its opener. The second is Unsolved Disappearances in the Great Smoky Mountains by Juanita Baldwin and Esther Grubb, which also covers the cases of Dennis Martin and Trenny Gibson. Finally, he references a newspaper article in the Atlantic Constitution from March 20th, 1919. Naturally, I decided it would be a good idea to read these sources as well as any others I could find, and the results were interesting. As I was reading through the sources provided by David Paulides, one thing that was clear off the bat was that his account did not necessarily match. While both Lost and Unsolved Disappearances do largely support the narrative given by David Paulides, there are some glaring differences. Both books are more detailed about the events that transpired, but in ways that are generally irrelevant to Paulides' conclusion. For example, Lost gives the number of Ramsey children as 7 and names all 5 still at home as Ola, Ruthie, Joe, Abe, and Ida, ranging in age from adolescent to infant. Unsolved Disappearances, on the other hand, does not mention the 2 older siblings, only giving the 5 who still lived at home. And if I'm remembering correctly, because I didn't write this part down, the wife's name was not given in the Lost account. It was given in Unsolved Disappearances, which, for the record, came out after Lost. Where things seriously differ is the suggestion about what happened to Abe. Where Missing 411 Eastern United States argues that he was kidnapped by something, the others suggest a much more tragic end to Abe's life. Arguing against the suggestion of kidnapping, Baldwin and Grubb suggest that the conventional wisdom was that a would-be kidnapper would find a more convenient place to steal a child. This is because the area was, according to them, one of the most surveilled in the United States due to the illicit alcohol trade. That's just not really true. While the feds were very much aware that there were moonshine stills out there was plenty of open space that they would not have been watching. No. You could kidnap somebody in the Smokies very easily today. Really, it would be getting them out of the Smokies that would be the difficult part. Do not take either of those things as a suggestion. We have plenty of cases to cover, do not make more. McCarter's book, on the other hand, does also argue against kidnapping, but for different reasons. Taken from a contemporary account, this version of the story includes John tracking down suspected kidnappers, but finding nothing. So if not kidnapping, what do they offer as an alternative? Supposedly, Abe wandered a few miles into the hills where he came across some of the moonshine stills. And from there, the tale diverges once again. The account in Lost makes note of a rumor that Abe fell into one of the whiskey barrels kept hidden beneath the earth, where he drowned in mash. This was supposedly covered up by the Moonshiners, who hid the body in a suitcase and buried it nearby. In the Baldwin version, which contains 3 variants, things are actually worse, though the first one is generally the same as the account given in Lost. In the second variant, Abe, being 3, made a lot of noise as he was approaching the moonshine still, which alerted the Moonshiners to the presence of an outsider. With federal agents being a legitimate concern, they assumed that they were about to be raided and grabbed their guns. They then called out asking for the password that one would use to identify himself as friendly, and when no response came, they fired their rifles in the direction of the sound. Supposedly, one of these shots hit Abe, and the panicked Moonshiners hid the body and swore an oath of secrecy. This was only revealed when the last of the Moonshiners, on his deathbed, admitted that it had been he who fired the fatal shot. In the third variant, the story is the same as the second, but adds a degree of tragedy by having it be John Ramsey himself that fired the fatal shot. I will point out that the story says that a whole bunch of them fired their rifles towards a sound, not something they could see, so I'm skeptical of the claim that anybody could know they fired the final shot if they didn't see where the shots went. Obviously, both books disagree with the conclusion given by David Paulides, and it struck me as odd that he would rely on them as a source of information for everything else, and then not this alleged confession. In any case, I was most curious about how trustworthy these 2 sources were, because they included a lot more detail than that Atlanta Constitution article. According to the paper, Ramsey followed an unused mountain path and was trailed for 5 miles towards the top of the Smokies, when all trace was lost. That's really all the background that we're given, which makes me wonder where the others got their information. I went through the books and checked for sources, and I found that Baldwin and Grubb didn't actually cite any. They do have a bibliography, but there are no footnotes, endnotes, or even inline citations. Furthermore, they don't cite any specific issues of newspapers or other reports, but rather the entire collection as listed in whatever archive they're using. This makes it functionally impossible to verify anything they say in the book, especially since one cited source reads, numerous internet websites. And one last thing is that they refer to the boy as Abraham Carroll Ramsey when all contemporary reports name him as Abraham Lincoln Ramsey. Lost is a little bit better because it simply reprints a work called A Hiking Trip Through the Great Smoky Mountains by Bayard H. Christie, who is said to have written it in 1919. Now, the reason I phrase it that way is that it seems nobody has been able to find the original copy. According to Ann Bridges, Russell Clement, and Ken Wise in Terra Incognita, an annotated bibliography of the Great Smoky Mountains, the oldest copy dates to 1966. And there, it appeared in the Sevier County News Record as a reprint from an unidentified source. So basically, somebody printed an article in the Sevier County Record, or submitted the article to the Sevier County Record. They printed it, but they just said it was written by Bayard H. Christie. They didn't give a book, they didn't give a journal, no essays, no original newspapers. They just said, this is by Bayard H. Christie, written in 1919. So if the article really was written by Christie in 1919, As far as I can tell, after a pretty thorough internet search, if it exists, it's gonna only be located on microfilm in the Sevier County Records Office. So if anybody lives in Sevier County and wants to go check out the library or the county records office and see if you can find this article, please do. I'd be curious to see if it's legit. But even if the document did exist and was actually written contemporaneous to the events by Bayard H. Christie, I have other reasons to doubt the authenticity of the story he tells. Those other reasons, newspaper articles specifically, were published on March 27th, 28th, and 31st of 1919. The first article, published in the Tennessean, bears the headline, "Mystery Solved as Body of Lost Child is Found." According to the author, the body of Abraham Lincoln Ramsey was found in a hollow log in a dense forest about 3 miles from his home. It was thought that the boy had crawled into the log to seek shelter as nightfall came, and that he died of either exposure or hunger. Personally, I also think that a deadly spider bite is a possibility here, as after 2.5 weeks of decomposition in a hollow log, in 1919, it would be nearly impossible to figure out if he was bitten by a spider. The reason I suggest that instead of accepting the exposure or hunger angle is that it seems likely to me that he would have been alive when search parties were still looking for him for a couple of days at least, so he would have heard them calling out. It's not really important how he died, I just wanted to give the suggestion. The second article, appearing in the Statesville Record and Landmark, notes the same fate without speculation as to the cause. And then the third article is basically a duplicate of the second, appearing in the Lincoln Times-News on the 31st. So, regardless of what Christie said in the article, if it was even a real article, the child was clearly not shot, kidnapped, or eaten by a bear. And as for the version given by Baldwin and Grubb, it seems that it's almost entirely a fabrication. This is the source of the claim that the other children went off to school, which is not present in a hiking trip or any of the newspaper articles. In fact, the papers directly contradict it, very clearly stating that the children went to a country store, Abe tried to follow them, and then a few miles from home, they told him to turn around and go back. They also explicitly stated that it appeared that as Abe was trying to walk home, he encountered a fork in the road and went the wrong direction. And that road led him up into the mountains. In addition, Unsolved Disappearances is the first source that I could find which makes any suggestion that John Ramsey was a moonshiner. A hiking trip does note that John's brother Lloyd owned a store in town, and that store was rumored to sell moonshine and moonshine distilling equipment, but it doesn't say that John was the supplier, and it doesn't imply it either. Baldwin and Grubb also appear to have invented the character of Motley the dog, who does not appear in any other source I could find prior to their book. And so far as I can tell, all sources since 1998 that have claimed Motley the dog existed are in some way, whether they're referencing someone who references it or directly referencing Unsolved Disappearances, they do go back to Unsolved Disappearances. That seems to be the origin of this claim. So while I won't accuse David Paulides of fabricating these aspects of the story, I do have to wonder why he didn't bother to fact-check any of his sources. And as he says in his case commentary, the dog is essential to understanding Abe's fate. So, without Motley, this isn't even a missing 411 case by his standards. If you've been watching our videos for a while, you're probably aware that my opinion on David Paulides has shifted over time, from what was initially a sort of reverence to more of a skeptical outlook. For a while, I was even of the belief that he was inventing aspects of these stories in order to make them seem more mysterious. For example, in his coverage of the Stacey Arras disappearance, he mentions a camera lens cap that isn't mentioned in any other official or newspaper report. In fact, the documents released by the National Park Service after a FOIA request regarding this specific case directly contradict that statement, saying that absolutely no trace of her was found. Another instance is in his coverage of Trenny Gibson's disappearance, in which he claimed that a boy named Robert Simpson said he saw a bear nearby that day, or I should say heard, I believe, a bear nearby that day. But upon review of Trenny's class in yearbooks available online, we discovered that she had no classmate by that name. So I assumed that David Paulides just made up this part of the story, assuming nobody would fact check him. And that's because, to me, Trenny Gibson's disappearance feels like a deliberate runaway situation, most likely under the manipulation of an older man. It was only when I was doing research for this case that I came across Trenny's story in Unsolved Disappearances. And I realized that the Robert Simpson narrative is in there. So it wasn't that David Paulides fabricated evidence as I had previously thought, but rather that he didn't properly vet his sources on this topic. It seems very likely that the same can be said for the Abraham Lincoln Ramsey story. Paulides found 3 sources and went with them, but he didn't look at the whole picture. He didn't go and find the other newspaper articles that are very clear that this child's body was found. He was not kidnapped. There was, and I do have to say, I know people argue with me about this, but if you read the books, he is very consistently, at least in 2011, there is a subtext that this is Bigfoot in not every story, but in really the majority of the stories I read. And I think, in my opinion, that's why the overarching Missing 411 profile doesn't make a ton of sense. Because it seems to me that what he was doing was trying to fit Missing 411 into Bigfoot sightings. Because if you look at the stuff that's given, it matches a lot with common Bigfoot sightings. We'll get more into this in the analysis video at the end of the series, and maybe we'll even revisit the whole concept when we finish all of the clusters, but that won't be for probably a couple of years, so sit tight. I do apologize. I know the format of this video was a little bit different, but I really had no other option but to do it this way or to just make it a footnote in another video. So I felt like this was the best opportunity to tell the story about the national parks, to give you the Abraham Lincoln Ramsey story, and then explain where some of my skepticism of David Paulides comes from as kind of a mid-series break. Next week, we're going to be jumping back into the mid-20th century, looking at some cases in the 1950s. One thing I will point out, by the way, is that one of the cases in the Great Smoky Mountains cluster is that of Mike Heron, but we covered Mike Heron's case less than a year ago and really with the same level of rigor that we do things now, so rather than redoing that video, I will probably include a summary of it in a later episode of this series, and I would just recommend that if you're interested in the full story, go back and watch that, because it is honestly a weird one. I won't say that it's Bigfoot weird, but it's definitely like meth and small town corruption weird. Anyway, with all of that said, we actually finally gave final approval on our bunker branding designs, so that will be coming very soon. I believe we're getting our first set of samples in the next couple of weeks, so you'll probably see me sitting here in our actual merch very soon. I'm very excited to bring that to you. We have such a cool new design for one of the shirts, and we can't wait to launch those. We hope you guys love them, and of course, we're so happy to be working with Bunker Branding. It is so great to be with an American company that does everything in the USA. It feels really good after a couple of years of Teespring. And I will tell you that in a couple of weeks, I believe June 14th? June 14th, the weekend of June 14th, Aiden and I are going to have a table out on Bridge Street in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania for Blobfest. And Blobfest is an annual thing that we do each year where we throw a giant block party because our movie theater was in a hit movie for 3 seconds. Phoenixville likes to make a party out of basically everything. That's what I love about this town. But I tell you this because if you stop by and you're one of the first probably 20 to 30 people that comes in, you'll get a shirt. And if you bring me a bottle of chocolate milk, I'll even sign it. So anyway, that's the weekend of July 14th, 2024. If you're watching this after July 14th, I'm sorry, you can't come because it's the past now. If you'd like to support our channel in other ways, you can do so by becoming a member on our Patreon or right here on YouTube by clicking the Join Channel button. You can also buy our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company so you can drink the Lodge. Drinking the Lodge is a great way to keep healthy, and I don't think I can actually say that. I'm not giving health advice. I'm just saying, drink the Lodge. Drink it. Drink. If you'd like more Lodge, the best place that you can keep updated is through our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge, and you can also subscribe to the Weird Bible Podcast. You can subscribe to the History Hut, my personal channel, Aiden Mattis. We have the Lore Lounge. We have a new Redacted Media channel as well that doesn't have anything on it. And then also, I am very happy to announce that launching the week of July 1st, we have a brand new show with a brand new host on our network, Off the Record with Luke Eccles. It is youtube.com/@offtherecords because Off the Record was taken. A couple of weeks after that, we will be launching the Boozy Mixologist channel, which once again, you can find by going to youtube.com/@boozymixologist. Very excited to launch both of those shows. They're going to be a lot of fun. They're going to be about music and, just crazy stories from the service industry. So if that's your kind of thing, go ahead, subscribe to those channels. They will have content very soon. And the sooner we get them monetized, the sooner we can grow more and add more channels covering more topics with more hosts. And I will say, if you have anybody who's in the southeastern Pennsylvania area who might be interested in doing their own show, we will be opening up applications probably in September. And the last thing I will remind you guys of is that we do have conversations about these topics live. We also bring guests on, and hopefully sometime in the near future, with your support, we will be able to afford flying guests in to come sit with us in studio. With all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.